Hello and welcome to Quilt Addicts Anonymous. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. We are continuing our Triangle Masterclass today, and today is all about putting it together so that you don't lose any points. I know you've all been there where you've got everything ready to go, you think you got it just right, and then those triangle points just aren't hitting right where you want them to. So we're going to cover how to make sure that happens pretty much every time. You know, it's not going to be every time, we're not machines, but it is going to be pretty much every time, and you're going to love the results. Today is also about learning how to fudge it, and that is incredibly important when you are quilting. You've got to learn how to make it work when it isn't quite right to start with, and trust me, every quilter does it. I do it all the time, and my long armor always talks about how she loves how flat my quilts are, so you can totally fudge it and still have a great quilt top in the end. All right, so just a reminder that the pattern that we're using, which includes the block that we're going to be putting together today, is called Raspberry Sherbet. You can get that over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com, and we've got kits while supplies last, and if you buy a kit, then you can get the pattern for free. You get to pick your own background, which is super fun, but the fat quarter bundle is the one that I'm using today, which you can kind of see in all its glory as we assemble everything. It really looks really pretty together. It's earth, wind, and fire, and the wind is the background fabric. It's got a lot of low volume, so you've got lots of options to pick from. And then you've got the earth as the more cool colors, and then the hot colors are the fire, of course. And that's from Free Spirit. It's mod cloth is what it's actually called, and you can see it all behind me as well, and it's been back there for the whole series. So again, any fat quarter bundle will do. Your fabric requirements are on the pattern to go with this, and you can use these techniques with any triangle block. It doesn't have to be this one, but if you want to follow along, you want to do all these things and have it come together like ours in the end, then go ahead and do that. All right, so this is a block that I designed when I was first teaching quilting, and really the whole quilt, to be able to utilize all the different block units that we have put together. We've got some half square triangles in the corner, some hourglass units in the center, some flying geese, and then the border is going to use all those double pinwheels, and we're going to use both of the mirror image sizes. It's going to look really pretty when it's all done. But today we're going to focus on just getting our block together. So I'm going to start just by putting my flying geese together first, because everything else is in a nice 4.5-inch unit at the right now. It'll be 4-inch finish once we get all those seam allowances tucked in, but these have to come together first, so that way we're essentially sewing together a 9 catch. So for right now, I'm going to move all my sashing strips to the side because we don't need those just yet, and really everything else, so that way we can just sew our flying geese together. All right, so I've cleared everything away, so we're just looking at our flying geese. Now, ideally, when you've sewn these, your point is going to be a 1/4 inch away from the edge of your fabric. Now, that doesn't always happen. It definitely isn't the case with this one. It's probably more like, a little bit more, I don't know, it's definitely not a 1/4 inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to flip these guys right sides together, and I'm going to do it so that way the point is on top, because that is really important. We're going to zoom in so you can see how that works and how I'm going to strategize sewing this together here. All right, so I'm going to demonstrate on this one because there's some fudging to do in it. So what we're going to do is we're going to sew so that we are just 1 needle width to the right of where this point is. So I want, when I'm sewing, my needle to come just to the right of where that point is, because then when we pull that open, that point is going to show up exactly where we want it. We're not going to cut it off, and we're also not going to have a big gap between the point and where the next bit of block is. Now I picked this one because this was one of the ones that was a little bit too big, the one that is underneath. Now it's not hugely too big. It is just maybe a 1/16 of an inch too large, but we're going to be able to fudge that a little bit. Now I don't want to just center it and sew it, because then I'm going to cut off my points. What I want to do is I want to ease in the length of this. So I'm going to pin this so you can kind of see how it works. I typically don't pin when I'm actually doing this in real life. I just kind of do it as I'm sewing, but I've done this so many times that it just is like second nature to me. So if you've never done this technique before, I recommend that you pin. All right, so I matched my points up there. I'm going to go ahead and put a pin in there. And then you can see if I were to just sew it, how much left is extra there. And so what I want to do now is I want to put my pin in here as well to get my corners nice and aligned. Now the reason why it's really important to have those corners in alignment is you've got to be really right on with this if you're going to have your points show up in the right place and not cut them off when we sew this into rows, because if this isn't right on, then your point is going to be probably a little too fat when you hit the corner, and it's going to be a hard time to get it to work. But if we look from the top, you can see that there is quite a little bit to line up there. So what I'm going to do is when I sew, I'm going to stitch maybe to about here, and then I'm going to give it some tension. And so I'm just going to pull it until it goes nice and flat like that. Now I'm not really tugging very hard on it. I'm just giving it enough tension to make it work. And it's going to work because these ones here are all on the bias, so that's a pretty flexible seam. If you think about it, our clothes are often cut on the bias so that it can move, and it's fabric, and so you can use that to your advantage. And then when we press that open, it's not really going to be super obvious that we fudged it a little bit. So biggest thing to do, make sure you're always lining up your points, even if they don't quite match perfectly. As long as you're off by less than a 1/16 of an inch, you're going to be totally fine. And you're going to make sure that you stitch one needle width to the right of this. Now I'm going to pull this one, because this one I can tell is too skinny. So I'm going to be stitching my 1/4 inch stitch, and then when I get to about here, I'm going to start aiming for where this is, and I'm just going to do a real gradual pull out from my 1/4 inch stitch to get to, so that I'm stitching right next to here. Then I'm going to gradually get back to my 1/4 inch seam. And by doing a nice little gradual slide over about an inch or so on both sides of that point, you're going to be able to still have a block that looks very flat, that performs the way it's supposed to, but you'll be able to have all your points where they're supposed to be, as opposed to just stitching across and hoping for the best. Now this is also why I always stitch with the point on top, because if I were to stitch from this side, then I can't see where that point is, and I can't ensure that I'm going to be stitching in the right place. Now also I'm going to make sure that I'm sewing with a regular 1/4 inch stitch. We are no longer using scant 1/4 inch seams for the rest of this quilt. We only use that when we're assembling our triangle units, but now we have everything to the size it's supposed to be, so we're back to our regular 1/4 inch stitch. Alright, so I'm going to start stitching just a few stitches in. Go ahead and remove that pin. Now that I've got all of this on this is the one that's a little too big on the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and give that a tug. I also want to make sure that my edge here stays in alignment with the edge of my fabric, because it's really easy for it to pop in one way or the other. So maybe like throw a second finger on there, and we're just going to stitch down. And I'm going to slow down. I'm aiming for just one needle width to the side of where that point is. So I've got a perfect little point when I'm done. Now I'm continuing, just keeping that tension on. I'm going to leave that pin in as long as I can. And I'm going to put my finger to the side as well, so that way I can maintain that 1/4 inch stitch all the way down. All right, so I eased that in. That was super simple, super fast. Now we're going to do the rest of them. I typically don't pin. What I typically do is I just grab them with my hands, line up my corners, and slide it under and stitch. Once I get a couple of stitches in, I'll line up that back corner again, and then I just kind of make sure that my edges are lined up, and keep a second finger in the middle. And now I'm going to come in just a little bit, because I'm not quite at a 1/4 inch from the peak of that triangle to the edge. And now I'm coming back to my regular 1/4 inch seam. And we're just going to keep on doing that as we sew our flying geese units together. All right, so this is that first one that I sewed where the bottom was a little bit bigger than the top. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna press the seam open. You can kind of see right now a little bit of a wobble, but once we get it pressed, it'll totally fit. So I press my seams open almost all the time. One of the big reasons I do that is when you press to the side, you're gonna eat up a little bit of fabric. And when you're trying to get multiple different size units to fit together perfectly, then you're gonna have almost no shot of making that happen, especially when you have a block like this with the flying geese, because it's just gonna eat up a little bit and it's not gonna end up being 4.5 inches square like we need it to be. Now, because it is a little challenging to press this going against that tip, I am gonna take my spray mister and I'm just going to hit that seam, and this will also help flatten out any of that bit that we eased in as well. All right, now that is super flat. The point is exactly where we want it to be, and we've eased that in very well. It is still, you can tell, a little bit wider, but we're gonna be able to catch that in the seam allowance without anybody knowing. Just when we get to that point, we're also gonna be paying attention to make sure that we are stitching just to the side of these points as well. No one's ever gonna know that we fudged it a little bit. This was one of the ones that had a skinny seam, so we came in a little bit on it to make sure that we wouldn't lose that point, because that's what matters. I'd rather have a skinny seam on the inside that nobody's ever gonna see than lose a point and have everybody know that I messed something up. I'm gonna press. Pressing with this spray mister too, and pressing your seams open, really makes for super flat points, because sometimes when you are doing this, it really just looks like your point didn't quite make it, but it's because it got pressed under. But when you press it open, it really just looks a whole lot better. Now, I could go back and mess with this a little bit more, but I'm pretty happy with the way that this looks. All right, I'm gonna press my others, and then we're ready to start sewing our rows together. I'm really pleased with how all of these turned out. My points are just exactly where they should be. And again, that's because we sewed just one needle width to the right of where that point is. And that's gonna be something you're gonna hear me say as we put this entire block together. It's very critical that you know where your points are and just sew one needle width to the right of it, even if it's not exactly a 1/4 inch seam. It could be a little bit over, a little bit under. That's the important thing, because you can press everything else out at this point. We're not talking about a huge amount that's gonna be noticeable in the final product of your quilt, but you will notice if these points are off every single time. But let me tell you, you're also gonna notice when they're on every single time, and that's worth fudging it just a little bit. All right, at this point, we essentially have a 9 patch that we have to put together. That's super simple. It's one of the first quilt blocks that typically you're taught as a quilter, but there are a couple things that we have to know in order to get the points where we want them to be, and that's where to pin. Now, this one, it's not gonna matter because we don't have any points coming together. We've got points on the outside, and then we have a point in the center, so nothing really has to pin together perfectly. We just need to make sure that we flip it right sides together and sew with this side on top, because we want to be able to sew just to the right of that triangle point, just like we did with the flying geese. All right, so for these, we've got a little bit of work to do here, because we do have points coming together at the bottom and at the top. So I want to make sure that I take my time when I pin those to make sure that they are nice and right on top of each other, so that the points not only come together in this seam, but also when we join it to the sashing block on the outside. Now, this one, I'm going to want to make sure that I sew with this part on top, because we can see that we have one of those little joins right here. So we want to make sure that we're going to sew just to the side of that. Now, this may seem slightly confusing when you're sewing it together, so I recommend that you just get everything flipped, so that way it's going to be in the direction that you're sewing when you put it together. So for me, I like to just pick it up and take it over to my sewing machine, and we're going to be able to do that here. All right, so I'm gonna get these pinned. I'm gonna show you how we do that here. All right, so you can see this really clearly because we've got background on one side and print on the other, and then it's flip-flop for the other side. So what I like to do is just look from above like this and make sure that those seams are right on top of each other, and it's really easy to see in a block like this. And then what I do is I put a pin in the right side of that seam allowance, because when I am stitching, I'm going to be able to just stitch right down here and be just to the side of this, and then we'll be good to go. Now remember, when this is in the block, it's going to look like this, but it's totally okay to just start from the top on this side and then stitch down. All right, so this block we don't have to pin anything on because there's no triangles to join, but we do have one here. So I'm gonna go ahead and get that lined up just like we did before. And this is gonna be super flat because we pressed everything open. So you won't have that big bulky seam where you may have gotten everything all together perfectly, but then when you pressed it over, it just sort of took up a little bit of room and it hid your point inside that seam, and that's no fun. All right, I'm gonna get these sewn together. And again, if they're not exactly the same size, like this one isn't exactly the same size, I'm just going to ease that in as I go. And that's really the thing, you know, like you might, especially in a block like this where we're sewing two together, it might not be absolutely perfect when you're sewing it to one that's been trimmed to 4.5 inches, but that's okay. You just ease in the teeniest little bit. As long as you're talking about less than a 1/16 of an inch difference, you can absolutely make that work and your quilt will turn out just fine. It will still be very flat. If it's more than that and they're not square, then we're talking about a different situation. But if it's mostly there, then you're totally okay. You can fudge it. I'm going to start by just lining up this top corner. You could always pin that as well if you so choose. I tend to pin only when I absolutely have to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start sewing, and then once I get just maybe 3/4 of an inch in, I'm going to make sure that everything is nice and lined up on the edges all the way down. And if I have to do any easing in, this is where I start it. I also like to put my hand right in the center where that seam is. And at this point, I'm going to start coming in just a smidge because I want to make sure that I'm going to come just to the side of that seam allowance where all those points come together. Now I'm going to sew down until I am as close to that pin as possible. I want to make sure my needle is down in the first half of that seam allowance, so it kind of acts like a pin, keeps those points nice and together. Now I can go ahead and remove my pin and sew the rest of the way down. All right, this is a block that we didn't need to do any pinning on because we don't have any points that match. So all we need to do is get our first corners lined up. I'm gonna start stitching just a little bit. Now I've got a little bit of easing in to do. My bottom block is just a smidge longer. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to line up those back points. You could pin this as well before you started, but I just hold it in place with my finger. Get my edges lined up and stitch down. Again, I'm making sure to sew so that I am just right to the side of where that point is. All right, now we've got our last one. This one I'm just gonna sew a teeny little bit to get my needle in right here, and then I can pull that pin. All right, so that is good to go. And I've got to do a little bit of easing on this one as well. So we're gonna match those bottom corners and stitch away. Make sure to sew just to the side of where that triangle is, at that center seam. Should be good to go. And when you're doing this, it's really important to lay everything back out to make sure you've got everything going in the right direction when you are lining these blocks out, because you will be able to tell if you mess something up. All right, so I've got my large triangles all pointing to the center here that are from fat quarters, and then I've got my large triangles from background pointing to the center of my horizontal row. So everything is looking the way it should. Now I'm not gonna press this yet, I'm gonna wait till everything's good to go, but this is looking really, really good. We've got good joints here, good joints here. This part is no joints to worry about. Good here and good here. So I'm really happy with the way that these all are looking so far. So now we're just going to do the same thing on the other side. We've got the same points to match at the top and the bottom, and then just do any easing in as needed. It's a good idea to kind of take a look from above and make sure that you are happy with how all the points are coming together. You can just kind of give it a tug open and make sure everything looks right. It does here, so I'm going to go ahead and press these open. gonna go ahead and give these seams a little spritz and give them an additional little press just to get them as flat as possible so that we have a great finished block. That is looking so good. I'm so excited about this. We can see really clearly where these points are all coming together, and then we didn't lose a single point on this triangle here. These are maybe just a smidge, like this one's just a smidge higher, but it's one of those things where once it's quilted, you will absolutely not be able to tell that at all. So I'm really happy with this. I'm gonna go ahead and press my others. And you remember, I believe this is the one that we had to ease in. You can't even tell. Like, you cannot tell at all that this was a full 1/16 of an inch wider than the other ones. They just look really good. And once it's quilted, it's gonna look even better. This looks really, really good. I'm very excited with how this is turning out. I also just want to point out, so this seam was a little skinny on this side only because my flying geese wasn't perfectly level on the top. But as long as you're going just to the right of where that point is and you are disregarding the seam allowance just a little bit for a teeny little bit of time, it's going to look fabulous from the front. And that's what people are going to see. No one's ever going to see the back of your quilt. It's going to be quilted on the inside. So as long as it lays flat, you're good to go. All right, so now I'm going to show you how I pin to get these points correct and these points correct. Actually, this is not really a point that's going to show anything. So really, we're worried about these points and this one here. So remember earlier, we were talking about pinning so that way our tiny little bits here, we're going to be able to sew to the seam side of that. Now we have them in this case, on this side we have 1, and on this side this is what we'll see. So we see 1, 2, 3, and 4. So these are our most important ones. So I'm going to go ahead and flip it so that that is a side that is up, because that is where I want to make sure that I'm sewing to the seam side of all those tiny little bits. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see how I pin everything together, and then we're going to be able to sew this block together. All right, so I'm going to start with my corners. We have 2 that match up. They're on the same side this time. So we're just going to line those up, and I can see from the top that I've got it in line where I've got my prints on one side and my backgrounds on the other. And I'm just going to put that pin in the right side of the seam allowance. Now here I don't have anything to match, so no big deal, nothing to worry about. Just make sure you're sewing to the seam side of that triangle. And here we have a triangle here, but we don't have one here. So all we have to do is look from the top and make sure that, again, that we've got our seams right on top of each other. And then I'm going to pin in the right side of that seam allowance again. Now this one is a little thicker because this is the one where we did press it to the side. So you do have to think about that. Now the reason why I pin on the right side of that seam allowance is because when we're stitching, we're going to stitch this way. So we'll be able to get it started and sew a couple of stitches, put our needle down, and then we can remove this pin. Then we can stitch, make sure we're to the seam side, the right side of where that point is. And then we can stitch down to here and stop with our needle down in the portion of the seam allowance right here, that side, and then we can pull this, and then we can keep on going, repeating that process as we work our way down. Now this one, we're just going to have to hope that we got that seam in the right spot. Hopefully it worked out. 9 out of 10 times it does. The rest of these I'm going to pin the same way I did my first half, and then we're ready to sew this together. Going really slow as I do this. I'm not whipping through. I just really want to make sure that I am sewing as close to those pins as I can, so that way we can keep everything together. And then also that I'm making sure to sew just to the right of where all those little seams come together, so that way we don't cut off any of our points. All right, because this is less about how to make the block and how to put the block together without losing all your points, I really want to show you close up what this looks like. So you can see, because I use very dark purple thread, that I sew just to the side of where those points are, here and here, and then also here and here. Now this one, there's one on the other side. We're just gonna have to hope and pray that it ended up in the right spot. It did. We're good there. You could always, if you were unhappy with it, unpick a little bit from side to side and then restitch, starting a little before and ending a little after. But this turned out really well. So I'm gonna go ahead and press this open. I'm gonna stress again how important pressing your seams open are, because at this point, you've got points going in a couple of different directions on both the middle row and the bottom row. So if we were to press one going underneath one, you're going to end up losing some points just because they got pressed under a seam. So that's not going to work. We don't want that. But when you press them open, it gets super flat. You maintain the size you're supposed to have. And then also you really don't lose points on either side. This looks really good both here and then also there. And then my outside points are really coming together perfectly as well, which means when I put my sashing on, they're just gonna come together fabulously and look great on the edge. All right, I'm gonna give this a press with my spray mister just to get it super, super flat. Then we're gonna repeat everything on the other side. Now remember, we wanna make sure to keep these up so that way we can see that when we are sewing. So even though it makes sense to just flip this down, we're gonna flip it the other way. And then I like to flip it around so that I have the point I'm pinning away from me. All right, now we have got a super flat block with all the points where they should be, including on the edges, so that way they can be right where they should be when they match up with our sashing as well. And it just looks fabulous. I really love how this is all coming together. Everything looks great. Everything is where it should be, and that's what you're aiming for. Now, not everyone is absolutely perfect. This one isn't quite exactly where it should be in terms of coming out to the edge, but you know what? It's pretty stinking close. I'm totally fine with that. No one is ever going to have a completely perfect quilt, but this is really good. I'm really pleased with these results. All right, so now we're going to add some sashing and then we're good to go. Now, if you are just watching this so that way you know how to put triangles together without losing points, you're good. You can go ahead and stop now. If you are doing the block, I'm going to show you the sashing and then give you some hints so that way you don't mess something up by accident. So half of the blocks, in order to get that little pinwheel look in the sashing, you're going to have the sashing be on the sides of the block like this, and about half, it's an odd number of blocks, but the other half are going to have it going across the top. So just make sure you're paying attention to your instructions and your printed instructions to go with this in raspberry sherbet, so that way you don't mess that up. So check that out, and I'm gonna get these sewn together. It's super easy. All we're gonna do is we're just gonna stitch these to the sides of our sashing, and then we're gonna attach everything to the center. So what I'd like to do, so I don't have to lay everything back out again, is I'm just going to flip my guys right sides together here, and I'm just going to put a pin in the side of it so that way I can keep it together. I'm going to pull this out before I actually start sewing, but I just want everything to be together and ready to go, so that way I can sew one side and then the other side and only have to lay it back out to press one time, which saves some time. If you are doing this as chain piecing, where you've got everything stacked and laid up on top of each other, you can kind of do this as you're going as well. It's totally up to you. Okay, so now for this part you gotta focus a little more on, because we still have two little bits here that we need to make sure that they end up where they're supposed to. So I'm going to go ahead and flip that right sides together, and then I'm going to flip it over so that way I can see my points up here. Now you may need to do a little bit of easing in as well. It's entirely possible that your block shrunk a little bit when you put everything together, but again, as long as it's not way too small, you're going to be totally fine, and you don't need need to worry about cutting everything down to size. But if it's like significantly smaller, like 1/4 inch, then you're gonna wanna make sure you're doing that. Basically anything more than a 1/16 of an inch difference, you're gonna wanna make adjustments. In this case, we're not that far off, and so we don't need to worry about it. I can just pin at the corners, and then I can pin at the seams of where my 9 patches come together, and that's going to be sufficient. I can ease anything else in beyond that. All right, I'm going to do the same thing for this side. I'm going to flip it over and do my pinning, and then I'm going to sew, and then we're going to press one more time, and then we're almost done with this block. All right, so I don't really need to do this for the little stashing strips because it's just tiny points. But because we've got a lot going on at these points here, which look fantastic, by the way, I'm gonna go ahead and give them a spritz with my spray mister and iron it before we sew our stashing strips to the block to finish it off. So again, if you're following along with the pattern, keep in mind that about half of the blocks are going to have your fat quarter fabric on the sides, and about half of them are going to have them on the top. It also matters which direction these are going, so that way you can create that pinwheel in the end. So make sure you're paying attention to your pattern so you get that correct. All right, so my block looks the way it's supposed to in the pattern. I've got my up and down is the large triangles as the fat quarters, and my side to side are the large triangles as the background. So that's what you have to pay attention to, and then where that shifts varies based on which block you're doing. All right, so I just have to pin these together. Now I've got a choice to make because we have 2 points here on the sides, but we also have 2 points here. Now I don't know about you, but I'm going to pay more attention to if these points match than if these points match. So I'm going to go ahead and have these be my up ones. So I'm going to go ahead and flip this this way. That way I can make sure to have this part here up, so I can make sure that that center star, which is the focus, is going to have all the points look the way they should. Now you have to make these decisions on your own as you're working with other patterns. You have to think, where's my focus? What do I need to be absolutely fantastic? And so you just make those choices as you go, and sometimes you end up ripping things out and doing them again, and that's totally fine. But if you use these techniques most of the time, you're not going to have to do that. All right, I'm going to spray the entire block with my spray mister. This is just water in here. I prefer to use that instead of steam in my iron because I feel like it doesn't distort the fabric as much, and then also it keeps your iron from getting gross and spitting water eventually. And what I just do is I'm just working my way across. I'm lifting the iron slightly as I move across, so I'm not like ironing it like you would a shirt, but I'm just pressing as I go along. This is going to get it nice and really, really flat, and it'll make it really ready to do some really cool things when we get to the quilting stage. So here we have it. It is our final block. It looks fantastic. Our points are all almost exactly where they should be. There's a couple that are off by just a hair, but they're pretty stinking close. I'm really pleased with these results. Everything is super flat, and we didn't start with absolute perfection when we were working with all of these. We had a couple of flying geese units that were a little bit off in size, where we had to ease some stuff in. This one here, we eased in a full 1/16 of an inch, and it still looks really good, and it's really flat, and it's pretty stinking square, and it is the size it should be. So we're gonna do just fine when we put this together in a full quilt, and it's gonna look fantastic. I hope you are enjoying our Triangle Masterclass. In the next video, we're gonna teach you how to do mitered corners, so that way when you have lots of triangles like this, you can keep those angles going out into the border as well. So our skinny border, once we put it all together, is going to have that. I really hope you are enjoying the series. I am having a lot lot of fun doing it. I love working with these fabrics. I think they're really pretty. And also I really love helping you guys demystify some things that maybe have been giving you trouble for a long time. And I know that losing triangle points and cutting them off and having them be way out in no man's land is a common problem that people have, as well as things not turning out the size we want them to. So hopefully these tips and tricks that we've gone over have helped you get things to be the correct size, and in today's video, know how to fudge it when it isn't quite right. So make sure you hit that subscribe button so that way you don't miss any of our tutorials on YouTube. They're always free to watch. And also go ahead and sign up for our email list over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. You get 10% off your first purchase when you join that list. And also we make sure you don't miss any of our new tutorials and our new fabric that comes out. If we still have kits available, you can get a kit of this, but we always have different fat quarters, so you can make it your own as well. And just make sure that if you're getting a kit, you can also get the pattern for free, so you can follow along with this quilt along. I've really been enjoying it, and we will see you in the next one. Until then, happy quilting.